I never thought I'd live to see the day my own son would be ashamed of me. I gave him everything, my youth, my strength, my health. I worked nights so he could eat during the day. I went without new shoes so he could wear brand new sneakers to school. I swallowed my pride more times than I can count, all because I believed a mother's love was enough to carry her children into a better life. And yet, after all of that, do you know what my son said to me? "Don't come to the baby shower, Mom. You'll embarrass us." Those words didn't just cut me, they broke me. They pulled open every scar of sacrifice and reminded me how invisible a mother can become, even in the eyes of her own child. I sat there, holding the phone in silence, trying to understand how I had gone from being his safe place to being the one he wanted hidden away. But let me tell you something. I did not crumble. I did not beg. Because this is the story of how a mother's dignity can be trampled and how I chose to rise. I will take you back to that moment, to the baby shower I wasn't meant to attend, and to the silence I carried as my only weapon. You'll hear how I walked into a room full of judgmental eyes, how I stood tall when my own son wanted me small, and how, without a single scream or fight, I reminded him exactly who I am. This is my story, and it begins with the words that almost destroyed me. I always imagined the day I would become a grandmother. For years, it lived in my heart like a quiet little dream. I pictured myself sitting at a baby shower, watching my daughter-in-law smile as she unwrapped tiny clothes and soft blankets, listening to my son laugh nervously as his friends teased him about sleepless nights ahead. And I pictured myself right there, in the middle of it all, holding my head high, with tears of joy in my eyes, knowing I had made it through all the storms of motherhood to arrive at that precious moment. So when I first heard the news that my son and his wife were expecting, I felt a kind of happiness I cannot even put into words. It wasn't just about the baby. It was about life coming full circle. My child, my baby, was going to have a baby. That meant my story, my sacrifices, my love, they would all continue into another generation. From the moment I found out, I began preparing little things. It wasn't much, nothing fancy. I'm not a wealthy woman, and I never pretended to be. But I knew how to pour love into the simplest of gestures. I started knitting again, even though my hands ache from years of work. I picked out soft yarn in pastel colors, a pale yellow that reminded me of sunshine, a baby blue that looked like the sky on a clear spring morning. Each stitch carried a prayer, a memory, a piece of me. I walked through dollar stores and discount shops, picking up small things whenever I could afford them. A rattle here, a set of bibs there, little socks so tiny they looked like they belonged to a doll. I wrapped them carefully, tucking them away in a box in my bedroom closet. It wasn't about the cost, it was about the meaning. I wanted to give my grandchild something that said, "Grandma was here from the very beginning. Grandma thought of you before you were even born." But as the weeks went by, I started to notice something that didn't feel right. My son didn't talk much about the baby shower. He'd mention the baby, sure. How the nursery was coming along, how his wife was craving certain foods, how they were painting the walls a soft gray. But when it came to the shower, there was a silence, a hesitation. I'd bring it up casually, the way mothers do. "So, have you picked a date yet?" I'd ask. He'd mumble something vague like, "Oh, they're still figuring it out." Or I'd ask, "Do you need help with anything? I can cook, I can decorate, I can contribute." He'd brush me off. "No, Mom, it's all handled." At first, I told myself I was overthinking. Maybe they were just busy. Maybe his wife's family was handling most of it. That happens sometimes. I tried not to take it personally. I reminded myself, don't be sensitive, don't make this about you. But the weeks turned into months, and the silence grew heavier. I'd hear little snippets through family whispers or see vague posts on social media about the shower being planned. Photos of decorations, lists of registries, people tagging each other in comments. Everyone seemed to know, except me. And still, my son said nothing. I cannot tell you the kind of ache that builds in a mother's chest when she realizes she's being left out. It's not like being forgotten by a friend or overlooked by a coworker. This was my son, my child, the same boy who once clung to my leg on the first day of school because he didn't want me to leave him. The same boy who cried into my chest when he failed his first math test. The same boy I worked double shifts for, so he'd never go hungry. And now he was living an entire chapter of his life without me. Finally, one day, I decided I couldn't tiptoe around it anymore. I called him directly, my heart pounding the whole time. "Son," I said gently, "I keep hearing about the shower. Am I supposed to just wait for an invitation in the mail? Or—" There was a long pause on the other end. Too long. Long enough for my stomach to twist into knots. Then he sighed. And in that sigh, I heard the weight of everything he didn't want to say. "Mom," he finally muttered, we don't think it's a good idea if you come." My hand froze around the phone. "What? Why not?" I asked, my voice shaking. And that's when he said it. The words that still echo in my head. The words that split me wide open in a way I didn't know was possible. "Because, Mom, you'll embarrass us." Embarrass. That was the word he chose. Embarrass. I sat there, holding the phone to my ear, but I could barely hear anything else. My ears rang. My throat closed. I think he tried to explain. Something about how his wife's family would be there, how they wanted everything to look nice, how they didn't want any awkward moments, but none of it mattered. All I could hear was that single word, embarrass. I wanted to ask him, how? How could I embarrass you? By showing my face, by loving you too much, by being poor, by not dressing in expensive clothes or speaking with the kind of polish your wife's family does. But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I sat in silence, my heart shattering piece by piece. Was I not good enough for my own family, after everything I had given, after the sleepless nights, the empty stomachs, the aching bones, the years of sacrifice? I raised him with my bare hands, with nothing but grit and prayer, and this is what I get, to be hidden away like a shameful secret. In that moment, I felt smaller than I ever had in my entire life. Smaller than when I went hungry so he could eat. Smaller than when I scrubbed floors for strangers just to pay rent. Smaller than when I stood outside of his basketball games, too broke to buy a ticket, just listening through the gym doors so I could cheer quietly from the shadows. And the worst part, he didn't even sound cruel. He sounded matter of fact, as if it were simply logical, reasonable, as if excluding me was no different than choosing a color scheme for the party. That's what broke me the most. I hung up the phone that day with tears streaming down my face. My hands shook, my chest hurt. I sat in the quiet of my living room, surrounded by the little gifts I had prepared for a baby shower I would never be welcome at. Tiny socks, a knitted blanket, a rattle. All of it suddenly felt like it didn't belong, like I didn't belong. I asked myself over and over, was I not good enough for my own family? Had I truly failed so badly as a mother that my presence was something to be ashamed of? I looked at those gifts, and I thought about tucking them away forever, maybe mailing them in a box, faceless and nameless, like the way they wanted me to be. But another part of me, a stronger part, whispered, "No, this isn't the end. They may want to erase you, but you are not so easily erased." That was the moment the pain began to turn into something else. Not anger, not yet, but a kind of quiet fire, the kind that starts small and builds until it cannot be ignored. I wiped my tears, folded the blanket carefully, and placed it back in the box, and I told myself, if they don't want me there, maybe it's time I remind them who I am, because I am his mother. And I will not be hidden away like shame. I will never forget the sound of his voice when he said it. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel in the way people usually imagine cruelty. No shouting, no anger, no harshness. In fact, that almost made it worse. Because when my son looked me in the eye over the phone, but I swear I could still feel it, and said, "Mom, you'll embarrass us," he said it so simply, so matter-of-factly, as though it were the most natural conclusion in the world. Not a warning, not an apology, not even shame in his tone, just plain, detached honesty, and that, right there, is what shattered me. It was as if I was nothing more than a stain he was trying to scrub out of his perfect picture. Like he was planning a party, carefully arranging decorations, and I, his own mother, was a piece that simply didn't match the aesthetic, something to be hidden away. The moment he said those words, my world went silent. It was as though all the air in the room was sucked out, leaving me gasping and hollow. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My heart pounded so hard, I thought it would break straight through my chest. I wanted to speak. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask, "How dare you?" But all that came out of my mouth was a faint, trembling whisper, "Embarrass you? How? How could I embarrass you, son?" But he didn't answer me the way I hoped. He sighed, like I was the one being unreasonable. "Mom, you just don't fit. It's not the kind of thing you'd be comfortable at. It's for her family, for her friends. We don't want it to be awkward." Awkward. That was the second word that gutted me. First, embarrass. Then, awkward. And suddenly, in my mind, I was no longer his mother. I was a burden, a blemish, something to be managed and explained away. The pain of that moment pulled me straight back into memories I had buried deep, memories of the sacrifices I had made, the countless ways I had carried him when I had nothing left for myself. I remembered standing in the back of a greasy fast food kitchen, wearing a uniform that smelled of old oil and burnt chicken, my feet blistered inside cheap shoes, my hands cracked from hot water and soap. I'd stumble home past midnight, too tired to eat, too tired to even sit, but I never missed putting a hot meal on his plate. I never missed slipping a few dollars into his backpack so he could have lunch money like the other kids. I remembered the Christmas when I pawned my own jewelry, my mother's ring, the only thing I had left from her, just to buy him the toy he wanted so badly. I told him Santa brought it. He never knew that his gift cost me a piece of my own history. I remembered the day he needed new shoes for basketball tryouts. The pair he wanted was expensive, more than I could afford, but I worked 2 extra shifts back to back, came home dizzy and aching, and handed him the box with a smile. He ran off to show his friends, never knowing that I spent the rest of the month eating canned soup so he could have those shoes. And I remembered the nights when he was sick, burning up with fever, and I sat by his bedside with a cool cloth, whispering prayers into the dark. He doesn't remember those nights, but I do. Every second of them. And now, after all that, I was nothing more than an embarrassment to him. The weight of it crushed me. I felt my chest ache with a pain I didn't know how to carry. My throat burned. My eyes blurred with tears. I couldn't stop. I collapsed onto the couch, the phone still warm in my hand, and I cried the kind of cry that comes from the deepest part of a person's soul, the kind of cry that shakes your body, that leaves you gasping, that makes you wonder if your heart will ever beat the same again. Was I not good enough? That question spun around and around in my mind like a cruel echo. Was I not good enough as a mother, as a woman, as a person. I gave him everything I had, and somehow it still wasn't enough. I was still not enough. For hours I sat in that living room, surrounded by the little gifts I had made and bought for my grandchild. My hands ran over the knitted blanket, soft and imperfect, with stitches uneven from my tired fingers. I stared at the tiny socks, the rattle, the bibs. All of it mocked me. All of it whispered, "You are not wanted here. Your love isn't the kind they want. Your presence isn't the kind they accept." And for a moment, a dangerous, terrifying moment, I believed it. I believed maybe I truly wasn't good enough. Maybe my son's new life, his new family, his new chapter was too polished, too perfect for someone like me. Maybe I was meant to fade quietly into the background, the way so many mothers do when their children build new worlds without them. But then, something inside me shifted. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was smaller than that, quieter. But it was real. It was a spark of defiance, a spark of dignity, a spark that whispered, "You are not worthless. You are not a mistake. You are his mother." And that voice reminded me of something important. Every sacrifice I had made, every tear I had shed, every long night and every hungry day, I had done it out of love. Real love. The kind of love that doesn't need an invitation to exist. Maybe my son thought I was an embarrassment. Maybe he thought I didn't fit into his shiny new life. But that didn't erase who I was. That didn't erase what I had done. That didn't erase the years of blood, sweat, and tears I had poured into raising him. I wiped my face, my tears still hot but my hands steady. And in that moment I promised myself something. I would not beg for a place in his world. I would not plead to be included. I would not let his words be the final definition of my worth. Because while those words, "You'll embarrass us," broke me, they also revealed something. They revealed that he had forgotten who I am. And sometimes the only way to remind someone is to show them. After the crushing words, after the silence that felt like 1,000 knives in my chest, I sat in the quiet of my living room and let the world shrink around me. The clock ticked loudly, each second a reminder of the decision I hadn't yet made. I could cry, I could scream, I could beg, I could call him again, plead, promise, apologize for what exactly? For existing? For loving too much? I thought about that for hours. But then a strange, steady thought began to grow inside me, like the first ray of light breaking through a stormy sky. I will not beg, I will not argue, I will not diminish myself to fit into someone else's idea of acceptability. It was a quiet kind of strength, not loud or violent. It was the kind of strength that sits in your bones, rooted deep in years of sacrifice, of heartbreak, of loving with nothing but hope and faith. I realized that showing up, not with anger, not with resentment, but with calm dignity, could speak louder than 1,000 arguments ever could. And so I made my decision. I would go. Not because I wanted to punish them, not because I wanted to prove them wrong, not out of spite, but because I loved my son and because I loved my grandchild. And most importantly, because I refused to let my worth be defined by someone else's insecurity. I whispered to myself, if they don't want me there, maybe it's time I remind them who I am. Those words echoed in the room, steadying me, giving me courage. Who I am. A mother who has given everything. A woman who has endured pain. A grandmother who carries love in every stitch of her hands. I had taught him how to walk, how to speak, how to love. Surely I deserved to be present on this day. Surely I deserved to see the child I had waited so long to meet. Once the decision settled in, the planning began. Quietly, thoughtfully, intentionally. I started with what I would wear. It had to be simple, elegant, something that conveyed dignity without shouting for attention. I rifled through my closet, fingers brushing over old dresses that still fit, scarves I had collected over the years, pieces that carried memory. Finally, I chose a dress, soft cream, modest, with delicate embroidery that reminded me of my mother's kitchen tablecloths, the ones I had used to wrap him in blankets when he was small. It wasn't expensive, it wasn't flashy, but it was me. It was history, love, and resilience woven into fabric. Next came the gift. Oh, how I thought about the gift. It could not be ordinary. I wanted it to carry meaning, to speak louder than words. I considered small trinkets, soft toys, blankets, bibs. And then I remembered the old family heirloom tucked away in my bedroom, a hand-carved music box that had belonged to my mother, passed down to me, and now waiting for the next generation. I had polished it carefully, the small golden accents gleaming in the soft light. I imagined the baby holding it one day, the tune playing softly as I had once played it for my son when he was afraid of the dark. It was perfect, not because it was expensive, not because it would impress anyone, but because it meant something. It carried generations of love, of endurance, of family ties that could not be broken by petty words. As I packed it carefully, wrapping it in soft cloth, I felt my resolve deepen. Every item I prepared, every stitch, every fold, was an act of quiet rebellion, not against my son or his wife. No, it was rebellion against the idea that my presence could be deemed unworthy, that my love could be dismissed, that my life could be erased from the story I had spent decades building. I rehearsed how I would enter the room, not hurried, not flustered, not apologetic. I would walk in with my head held high, arms carrying the gift and the hope that my presence could speak for me when my voice could not. I imagined the look on his face, the subtle shifting of guests' eyes, the silence that would fall, not out of fear, but out of recognition that I had always been here, always loved, and could not be ignored. There was a part of me that trembled with fear. What if they rejected me outright? What if his words echoed through the room again, louder, sharper? What if my presence caused the embarrassment he feared? I let that fear settle for a moment. I acknowledged it, and then I set it aside. Because I realized something that night, sitting alone in the dim light of my living room, the music box gleaming in its cloth. I am more than their opinion of me. I am the sum of decades of care, of sacrifice, of love poured into people who sometimes forget how much they owe. I am his mother. And my love is not optional. I didn't need to announce my decision. I didn't need anyone's approval. I simply needed to act, to move, to show up. So I laid out the dress, polished the shoes, double-checked the gift, and looked at myself in the mirror. I studied the face staring back at me, tired, lined with years of work and worry, yet unbroken, eyes that had seen too much and survived, hands that had held, healed, and nurtured, a heart that had loved against all odds, and I whispered softly, almost to myself, tomorrow they will see me, not as a mistake, not as an embarrassment, not as an outsider. They will see me as I have always been, a mother, a grandmother, a woman who refuses to be invisible. The quiet planning stretched late into the night. Every detail mattered. Every choice mattered. Every moment of preparation was an act of love and self-respect intertwined. I was no longer the anxious mother waiting for permission. I was the mother who carried her dignity in her chest like armor. By the time the candle burned low and the house was silent, I was ready. Ready not for confrontation. Ready not for battle. Ready simply to be present, to remind them through my quiet resolve, my gestures, my very being, that love cannot be erased, that a mother cannot be ignored, that the bond we share runs deeper than pride, embarrassment, or petty fears. And as I finally lay down, the music box tucked safely in the gift box beside me, I felt a calm strength, not triumphant yet, not victorious, but steady. A quiet fire burned inside me, and I knew that tomorrow, when I walked into that room, everything would change, not because of anger, not because of revenge, but because of love and the unwavering courage of a mother who refuses to be invisible. I arrived at the house just as the soft hum of chatter filled the room. The windows were open, letting in a gentle spring breeze, and the scent of freshly baked cupcakes lingered in the air. Balloons bobbed lazily near the ceiling, pastel pinks and blues reflecting the soft sunlight. Everything looked perfect, too perfect. And then, in the next moment, I realized I was the disruption. As soon as I stepped onto the porch, the room went still. Not completely silent. No, that would have been too kind. But the chatter faltered, conversations paused mid-sentence, and eyes slowly turned in my direction. I felt them all, the gaze of everyone in the room, some curious, some judgmental, some with faint, polite recognition of the woman standing there, who should not, by their reasoning, have been allowed to exist in this space. "What is she doing here?" I heard someone whisper. Not loud, but just enough to cut through the muffled music and the faint laughter. I took a deep breath. I had rehearsed this in my mind 1,000 times, yet nothing could truly prepare me for the heat of dozens of eyes fixing on me. I felt my chest tighten, a familiar tension threatening to pull me back into doubt, fear, shame. But I didn't give it room. I lifted my head and walked forward, slowly, deliberately, each step measured, each movement intentional. My back was straight, my shoulders steady, my gaze forward. I didn't flinch. I didn't lower my eyes. I didn't apologize for existing. I could feel the whispers continue, a low hum of surprise and unease. But I kept moving, past the table, stacked with pastel decorations, past the neatly arranged chairs, past the proud smiles of his wife and her friends. I was invisible to no one, yet I refused to let anyone dictate my presence. I carried the gift with me. The music box, wrapped carefully in soft cloth, tucked into my hands like a precious truth I was about to reveal. I did not raise my voice. I did not announce myself. I let my very being speak. And in that moment, the room seemed to shift. I placed the gift gently on the table. No dramatic gestures, no flourish, just steady hands laying down decades of love, sacrifice, and care. The motion was simple, unassuming, almost like setting a delicate vase in its place. But the room changed. You could feel it in the air, a ripple of curiosity, of judgment, of quiet shock. Eyes widened, heads tilted. Conversations hesitated. I imagined some were thinking, she shouldn't be here. This isn't her place. Others perhaps realized, for the first time, the weight of what I represented. Every stitch in that blanket, every sleepless night, every tear I had shed for my son, every meal I had skipped to put food on his plate. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. I didn't smile. I didn't scowl. I simply existed, solid, quiet, unwavering. And that alone changed the room more than any argument ever could. Whispers continued, subtle, low, the kind that leak through polite smiles and careful glances. She actually came. She brought a gift? Is that her? I could feel the tension coil like a living thing around me. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was confusion, disbelief, and that subtle undercurrent of fear that comes when someone refuses to be erased. And in the midst of it, I held my ground. I breathed deeply, letting the scent of the baby shower, the pastel balloons, and the soft chatter fill me, grounding me in the certainty that I belonged. I noticed my son then. He was frozen, mid-step, a faint flush rising to his cheeks. His hands twitched, uncertain where to place them. His mouth opened, as if to speak, but no words came. I could see the exact moment panic settled into his features. He hadn't expected me to act with such quiet determination. He hadn't expected me to exist in this space on my terms. His wife looked equally startled, a tight smile forming as she tried to maintain control of the gathering. Friends and relatives glanced at each other, exchanging silent, puzzled looks, the kind that communicate, "What is happening?" And still, I said nothing, because I didn't need to. My presence, my calm, my dignity spoke louder than any words could. The music box rested on the table, a quiet testament to the depth of my love and the weight of my sacrifices. It did not shout. It did not demand. It simply was. People began to notice little things. The way my dress hinted at a life built on care rather than extravagance. The subtle lines in my face that told stories of decades of sleepless nights and endless work. The steady posture of a woman who refuses to shrink under scrutiny. The air thickened with anticipation. Eyes followed my every movement as I adjusted the placement of the gift, smoothing the cloth around it, making sure it sat just so. Even the smallest gesture seemed amplified in the charged atmosphere. Some watched in awe, some with thinly veiled contempt, some, I imagined, in silent admiration of the courage it took to simply step into a room that had been built to exclude me. I saw a little cousin of my son peek at me from behind a chair, curiosity outweighing caution. Their eyes met mine for a fleeting second, and I smiled softly at them, a simple acknowledgement of love that no one could take away. And in that small moment, I felt a surge of calm power. My son finally found his voice, hesitating on the edge of a phrase that would have dismissed me, but he faltered. His words caught somewhere between expectation and disbelief. I stood still, waiting, letting the silence stretch like a bridge between what he thought and what was real. The room itself seemed to lean forward. Conversations halted. Laughter faded. Even the faint notes of a song playing from a small speaker lost their significance. All eyes were on me now, whether they wanted to be or not. I did not smile triumphantly. I did not raise my chin arrogantly. I did not seek recognition. I merely stood, arms relaxed at my sides, head held high, presence undeniable. And in that moment, I understood something profound. They had expected me to shrink, to apologize for existing, to be embarrassed by their rules. But I refused. And just by standing, by existing fully, completely, lovingly, I had begun to rewrite the story they thought they controlled. Whispers floated again. She's still here. She didn't leave. She brought a gift. Curiosity mingled with judgment. Judgment mingled with awe. Awe mingled with shock. And I stood at the center of it all, calm, poised, unyielding, because I had decided, not with anger, not with revenge, but with love and dignity, that I would show them who I am. And at that moment, they could no longer ignore me. The moment my son finally found his words, the room shifted again. His face was flushed, a mixture of embarrassment and anger that only intensified as he stepped closer, lowering his voice in that careful, controlled tone parents often use when they think they're scolding a child. "Mom, I told you not to come," he said, barely above a whisper, yet loud enough for those nearest to hear. "This was supposed to be private. We didn't want—" His eyes flicked nervously toward his wife, who now stood behind him, perfectly composed, yet radiating tension. This to be awkward. Awkward. That word again. A word meant to dismiss me, diminish me, erase the years of love and labor that had built our family, the sacrifices that no one seemed to remember but me. I felt the tension rising in the room like a storm cloud ready to break. Relatives murmured softly among themselves. Some glanced sideways at my son, their expressions betraying faint judgment. Others avoided my gaze, uncertain how to navigate the uncomfortable air. Whispers moved like currents. She shouldn't be here. Why didn't she wait outside? It's her son. How can she be treated like this? I took a slow breath, letting it fill me, letting the calm settle over me like a shield. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lunge forward. I didn't apologize for existing. Instead, I smiled softly, my hands resting lightly at my sides, the music box still on the table, perfectly placed. I will not raise my voice, I said quietly, though my words were barely necessary. My presence is enough. At first, a few heads tilted, confused. Some guests exchanged small glances. They weren't sure if I was being defensive or foolish, but as I held my posture, calm and unyielding, the room's energy began to shift. The whispers paused, curiosity overtaking judgment. I could see some relatives, particularly the ones closest to my heart, leaning forward slightly. Their eyes held recognition of me, of what I had endured, of the decades of tireless love and sacrifice that had brought me to this very moment. Their muted support was subtle, but it was real. Meanwhile, my son's frustration grew. You could see it in the tightening of his jaw, the quick, nervous glances around the room. He wanted control. He wanted to direct the narrative, to shame me into leaving, to remind everyone I was unwelcome. But no matter what he tried, the energy had shifted. The audience of relatives, the subtle murmurs of support, the tiny nods, the widened eyes, they were no longer following his lead. They were watching me. His wife attempted to intervene next, her voice clipped, controlled. "Mom, please, this isn't appropriate. You shouldn't." Her words stumbled as she realized the subtle current of the room had already changed. Her carefully constructed atmosphere of control, built over weeks of planning, began to unravel, thread by thread. I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend myself. I simply stood there, letting the truth of my being speak louder than their curated words. Every line in my face told a story of sleepless nights, of early mornings, of endless work, of meals skipped so my children could eat, of birthdays and holidays spent, ensuring they felt loved. Every wrinkle, every tired smile, every scar whispered the same thing: I am here, I am real, I am not ashamed. Some relatives subtly began to realign. Aunts and cousins shifted in their seats, some leaning forward, some offering small nods, small smiles of acknowledgement. The air was no longer entirely mine against theirs. It was balanced now, almost imperceptibly at first, but the tide had turned. I could see my son's growing desperation. He tried again to assert dominance. "Mom, I just..." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the tension he was struggling to control. "I wanted everything to be perfect. This isn't..." He gestured vaguely toward the gathering, as if the decorations themselves were evidence against me. I shook my head ever so slightly, softly, with compassion rather than reproach. "Son," I said, calm and deliberate, "perfection is not what makes a family. Presence, love, and respect, those are what matter. I am here for the baby. I am here for you. And that is enough." The room shifted again, the whispers, the murmurs, the tiny glances between guests. They were no longer just judgment. Now there was curiosity, an acknowledgement that something fundamental was being tested. Who had the right to define belonging? Who had the power to erase decades of sacrifice? I noticed a few of his friends, the ones who hadn't spoken yet, watching me with wide eyes. Perhaps they had never witnessed a confrontation like this. Quiet, composed, yet filled with undeniable strength. They were seeing the mother who had given everything, not just words or gestures, but a lifetime of love. And they were sensing the imbalance. I could feel it in my son. He grew restless, his fingers fidgeting, his posture tight. His carefully crafted narrative, designed to humiliate, control, and exclude, was unraveling before him. He could not stop it. No argument, no whispered or order, no subtle attempt at shame could erase the quiet power I carried simply by being there. And that realization seemed to terrify him more than any loud confrontation ever could. He opened his mouth again, attempting a final intervention, but his words faltered as the relatives, subtly, collectively, began to turn their attention toward me rather than him. Some of the murmurs shifted to gentle encouragement, some nods of support, others still held judgment, but the balance had changed. The room now acknowledged my presence, not as a threat, not as a mistake, but as undeniable reality. For the first time, I could see his frustration edge toward panic, his control slipping through his fingers like sand, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He had wanted to define the story. He had wanted to control perception, but I had already rewritten it simply by showing up, by carrying myself with quiet dignity, by refusing to apologize for existing. I didn't move closer. I didn't engage further. I allowed the shift to continue naturally. The atmosphere of judgment, the whispers of disapproval, the cold stares, they were all slowly melting under the weight of my calm presence. I glanced around the room, seeing eyes that had once been indifferent now, curious, tentative, maybe even admiring. Some faces softened, recognizing the courage it took for a woman to stand silently, powerfully, in the face of humiliation. And in that quiet, tense space, I understood something vital. Confrontation doesn't always require words. Sometimes strength lies in restraint, in calm persistence, in the act of simply existing where you were told you did not belong. My son, no matter how frustrated, could no longer dictate the narrative. The room had already shifted. His attempts to shame me, to belittle me, to erase me had failed. And I knew in that moment that the balance of power was quietly, irrevocably tilting, because love, dignity, and presence, those things cannot be hidden, they cannot be silenced, and they cannot be denied. The moment had come. The gift table sat in the center of the room, pastel tablecloth, cupcakes, and neatly wrapped packages surrounding it like soldiers at attention. I could feel the eyes on me as I gestured subtly toward my own gift, placing it carefully so it would not topple or seem showy. The music box, wrapped in soft cloth, rested in plain view, now, unassuming, almost shy in its quiet dignity. No one spoke. The room felt heavier, pregnant with anticipation, each person aware that something significant was about to unfold. I could feel my son's eyes on me, a tight mix of embarrassment and growing panic. He had no idea what I had brought, no idea of its weight, its meaning, and I would not tell him. When it was time for the gifts to be opened, the relatives leaned in, curious. Someone began unwrapping a plush toy, another carefully removed ribbons from a small box of clothes. The atmosphere was festive, light, yet strained with the unspoken tension of my presence. And then, finally, it came to mine. I handed the package to my daughter-in-law, keeping my expression calm, serene, almost neutral. No smile, no flourish, just quiet. She hesitated briefly, perhaps sensing that this was not an ordinary gift. She carefully removed the cloth, revealing the music box inside. The room fell silent. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't something that could be displayed on Instagram or shouted about with friends. But the impact, the weight of it, was immeasurable. I saw the first flicker of understanding cross her face, then the faces of others nearby. Eyes widened as they recognized it for what it truly was, a hand-carved music box, worn slightly by age, polished lovingly, its golden accents gleaming softly. The familiar tune, quiet at first, began to play as the wind caught the delicate mechanism. A ripple passed through the room. Guests whispered softly. The conversation hushed to a murmur. "Isn't that," one aunt began. "That's your mother's?" Another asked. Recognition dawned, a subtle understanding of history, of love, of sacrifice. I could feel the room's energy shift palpably. The quiet reverence was like a tide washing over everyone's judgment. They began to see not just the gift, but the lifetime behind it. The countless nights I had stayed awake with my son, the tears I had wiped from his cheeks, the meals I had skipped to make sure he ate, the clothes I had patched, the blankets I had sewn, the sacrifices no one noticed until now. And my son was frozen. I could see the shame creeping across his face. The flush in his cheeks deepened. He looked around at the guests, then back at the music box, then at me, and the realization hit him. This wasn't just a gift. This was a legacy of love, of devotion, of a mother's heart that had poured everything she had into him, expecting nothing in return. His carefully constructed world, the one where I was meant to be a shameful afterthought, a guest to be managed or dismissed, began to crumble. He had wanted to control the narrative, to dictate who should or should not witness this event, to erase me from the celebration of the family I had helped build. But here I stood, quietly, gracefully, and the truth could not be denied. I did not scold him. I did not shout. I did not humiliate him in front of the room. I let my actions speak. The gift spoke. The decades of love and sacrifice spoke. The very presence of a mother who refuses to be invisible spoke. Guests shifted in their seats, some leaning forward, some whispering to neighbors, the undercurrent of admiration growing. You could feel it, subtle but undeniable, the respect and awe for a woman who had endured, persevered, and stood silently, powerfully, in the face of hurt and exclusion. My son's frustration was evident. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, searching for words that would reclaim control. There were none that could. His attempts at defensiveness faltered against the quiet, unyielding force of truth. I could see his wife, too, caught in the moment, unsure whether to maintain her composure or acknowledge the depth of what had just been revealed. She glanced at the room, at the way eyes were subtly turning toward me, the way conversations had shifted from hushed judgment to recognition, curiosity, and even reverence. The music box played on, each delicate note echoing through the room, carrying with it the weight of a mother's love and decades of silent devotion. Children paused mid-play, relatives adjusted in their seats, and I could see the tension in the air crack, like thin ice beginning to give way beneath a heavy weight. I placed a hand lightly over the music box, feeling the smooth wood, the history carved into it, the care of generations before me, and I let the silence stretch. No words were needed. The message had been delivered. My love, my sacrifices, my presence. It was undeniable. And the sting of embarrassment for my son was palpable. His authority in the room quietly undermined, not by confrontation, but by truth. In that moment, I realized something vital. Quiet revenge is more powerful than loud confrontation. It does not humiliate. It does not shame. It does not provoke defensiveness. Instead, it allows the truth to unfold naturally, exposing pretenses, unraveling false narratives, and letting the weight of genuine love do the work that anger or words never could. I did not need applause. I did not need acknowledgement. The recognition in the eyes of the guests, the subtle nods, the soft whispers of awe, and the undeniable shift in the room's energy were enough. I looked at my son one last time during the opening, and the shame in his eyes was unmistakable. He had underestimated me. He had believed he could control the story, control perception, control me. But I had done nothing except act with love, dignity, and quiet resolve. That alone had been enough to reclaim my place, to assert my worth, to remind everyone present, including him, that a mother's love cannot be erased, cannot be diminished, cannot be silenced. And as the music box played its gentle, familiar tune, I felt a sense of peace, of vindication, not through anger or confrontation, but through the enduring, undeniable force of love and presence. My quiet revenge had landed perfectly without a single raised voice, because sometimes the strongest message does not come from words. It comes from action, from history, from truth carried patiently, gracefully, without apology. And in that room, in that moment, that message was clear. The baby shower was over, but the ripples it sent through my life continued long after the last guest had left. I returned home carrying a mixture of exhaustion and quiet triumph. The house felt unusually still, almost sacred in its silence. I set down my purse, carefully placed the gift back on the shelf, and sank into the familiar embrace of my armchair, letting the tension in my shoulders slowly loosen. For the first few days, there was nothing from my son. No calls, no texts, no attempts at reconciliation. Just silence. I suppose in his mind that silence was a punishment, a way to assert control. But in reality, it was a testament to the shift that had occurred. He had underestimated me. He had tried to erase me, to define me by his embarrassment and fear. And in the end, the silence revealed more about him than it did about me. Meanwhile, the extended family began to stir. Aunts, cousins, friends who had attended the shower whispered to one another, sharing their versions of what had transpired. Some voices carried judgment, clinging to their preconceived notions, unwilling to accept that I had acted with dignity. Others, quieter, spoke with a subtle reverence, acknowledging the courage it took to stand in a room where one was made to feel unwelcome, and to do so without resentment, without anger, and without apology. Every whispered conversation, every subtle nod of support, added layers to the realization I had quietly hoped for. My presence, my love, my sacrifices could not be erased. I did not need to shout to be heard. I did not need to argue to assert my value. The truth had been quietly, irrefutably revealed through my actions. Finally, after several days, the phone rang. I saw his name on the screen and felt a brief, flickering impulse, a mix of old habit and caution to answer, but I hesitated. I did not pick up immediately. I let the ringing continue, a quiet assertion that I would not be summoned merely to placate his discomfort. When I finally did answer, his voice was cautious, tentative. "Mom, I wanted to," he began, then faltered. There was an edge of fear beneath the words, a recognition that the balance had shifted and that his carefully constructed dominance had been quietly undone. He had expected submission, apology, embarrassment. He had not expected the calm dignity with which I had carried myself, the quiet strength of a mother who refuses to shrink. I listened, not interrupting, letting him fumble, let him confront the reality that his control was gone. The truth was clear, unspoken. He had tried to erase me, to exclude me, to dictate my place in my own family, and in the process, he had revealed himself, his insecurities, his impatience, his fear of being overshadowed by love he had long taken for granted. I spoke only gently, firmly. "Son," I said, "I will always love you, but I will not live my life seeking your approval. I am not here to be hidden, ignored, or diminished. That chapter of our story, it is closed. We will navigate the future, yes, but it will not be on terms that erase who I am." There was silence on the line, the weight of my words settling. I could hear him breathe, the tension, the hesitation. In that pause, I felt the fragile thread of trust that had once been assumed, now fractured. And I did not apologize for that. I did not soften my stance. I had given him nothing to manipulate. I had given him only truth. Over the next few days, I began to reclaim the rhythm of my life, the routines and rituals I had long deferred to the whims of family approval. I went for walks I had postponed, revisited friends I had neglected, immersed myself in hobbies that reminded me of the woman I was outside of my role as mother and grandmother. I found solace in the quiet moments, the small acts of self-care that had once seemed indulgent, now necessary. Every step of reclamation carried a subtle defiance, not loud or confrontational, but steady and undeniable. I began journaling again, reflecting on the life I had built, the love I had given, and the boundaries I had learned to assert. I savored meals without guilt, allowed myself long baths, listened to music that moved my soul rather than simply providing background noise. Friends noticed. Some relatives quietly observed as well. There was a subtle shift in perception. A mother who had once been overlooked, who had been dismissed and belittled, now moved through her days with renewed energy and quiet authority. Her presence was no longer contingent upon approval from those who had tried to diminish her. I reflected often during these days on the lesson that had crystallized in the aftermath. The desire to erase me had revealed him, not me. His actions, his words, his attempts at control had exposed insecurities, limitations, and fears. Meanwhile, I had survived, thrived, and reclaimed my dignity, not through confrontation, but through steadfast, deliberate self-respect. It was a subtle kind of victory, one not measured in applause or acknowledgement, but in the quiet, unshakable knowledge of one's own worth. Each morning, as sunlight spilled into my living room and illuminated the music box I had placed on my shelf, I felt a gentle, steady reminder. I had not only survived their attempts to diminish me, I had emerged stronger, calmer, more present in my own life than ever before. Even when he called again, attempting reconciliation or explanation, I responded with measured warmth, never defensive, never demanding. I listened, I acknowledged. But I did not erase the lessons learned, nor did I permit the past to be brushed aside. Trust, once fractured, required time, patience, and acknowledgement of truth. And I had no intention of pretending it had never been broken. Instead, I focused on my life, my routines, my joys. I began to host small gatherings of my own, sharing stories, laughter, and love in spaces where my presence was celebrated rather than questioned. I walked with my head high, moved through my days with the calm assurance of someone who had endured, witnessed, and emerged victorious through the simple yet profound act of refusing to diminish herself. In those quiet moments at home, sipping tea by the window, journaling thoughts that had long been silenced, I felt an inner freedom I had not known in years. No longer living for the approval of a son who had tried to erase me, I began to exist fully for myself and for the grandchildren who would come to know not just a mother, but a woman who refused to be invisible. And in that, I found peace. Not loud, not flashy, not performative, just quiet, enduring, and unshakable. The aftermath had revealed more than any confrontation could. A mother's dignity, once asserted, cannot be undone, and a life reclaimed cannot be stolen by those too small to see its value. I whispered to myself one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon. He wanted to erase me. Instead, he revealed himself. And I am free. From that moment on, I walked through my days with a new kind of calm authority. I laughed more freely, moved with purpose, and cherished every small act of love and connection that was mine to give. And in doing so, I discovered that the quiet reclamation of one's life, after betrayal and dismissal, is the truest form of victory a mother can achieve. A mother gives everything, every sleepless night, every sacrifice, every tear, every joy, all poured into the children she loves. And sometimes her own children forget. They forget the work, the devotion, the heart that built their lives. They forget the quiet moments that went unnoticed, the steady hands that guided them when no one was watching. But one day they remember. And in my story, that day came sooner than my son expected. I learned in the stillness after the storm that dignity is not something given to you by others. It is something you claim for yourself, quietly, firmly, without apology. Self-respect is not contingent on approval. It is standing tall even when those around you try to diminish you. And sometimes the quiet power of presence, simply being who you are, loving without expectation, speaks louder than any argument ever could. I will always love my son. That will never change. But I have also learned a vital truth. I will never again beg to be part of his life. I will not shrink to fit into someone else's vision of who I should be. I will not silence myself to make others comfortable. I have chosen love, yes, but also strength. I have chosen my dignity, my respect, and the life I have built for myself, fully and unapologetically. And in doing so, I have discovered something every mother deserves to know. Your value is never defined by the approval of those who cannot see your worth. So I stand tall, heart full, head held high, knowing that love can endure without surrender, that presence can teach lessons without words, and that even after hurt, a mother's spirit can rise, unshakable, unwavering, and beautifully free.